The restaurant exuded wealth and exclusivity, its polished marble floors gleaming under dimmed chandeliers, casting a warm, almost golden glow over the room. Soft jazz music floated through the air, mingling with the quiet clink of silverware and the hushed conversations of patrons. Maya Johnson sat at a corner table, her back to the wall, allowing her to survey the room without drawing too much attention. But no matter how hard she tried to blend in, the reality was impossible to ignore. She was the only black person in the sea of well-dressed, affluent, mostly white patrons. Her presence, though quiet, was a stark contrast in this world of privilege. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears, but her face remained calm, her expression unreadable. Years of training had taught her to project composure, even when the weight of racial and social dynamics pressed on her shoulders. Her assignment was critical. Carlos Ortega, a dangerous and charismatic Latino businessman, was under investigation for laundering vast sums of money through legitimate businesses like the one she was currently sitting in. This restaurant wasn't just a place to dine for the elite, it was a hub, a meeting point for powerful figures who operated both above and beneath the law. Maya's eyes, sharp but concealed under the guise of casual interest, scanned the room. Carlos sat at the far end, surrounded by a few men who looked just as polished but carried the kind of tension in their shoulders that spoke of dangerous secrets. They laughed easily, their expensive suits and practiced smiles masking the dirty dealings that Maya knew went far deeper than the luxury of their surroundings. Ortega was a smooth operator, careful never to expose too much, but tonight Maya hoped to catch something, a look, a coded phrase, anything that could tie him to the illegal operations she and her team had been tracking for months. She was deep undercover. Her silver bracelet, delicate and elegant, housed a recording device, and her purse contained a small camera hidden behind the clasp. The technology was state-of-the-art, but that didn't make her feel any less exposed. Tonight, more than any other night, she felt vulnerable. The looks from the other diners were subtle but unmistakable. They glanced her way, some with curiosity, others with the kind of indifference that came from people who saw her as an outsider, an intruder in their world of comfort. As Maya pretended to examine the menu, her fingers brushed its smooth leather cover, but her mind was miles away, focused on the operation at hand. The stakes were high. Carlos Ortega was not just another businessman. He was deeply embedded in organized crime, and taking him down could have far-reaching implications. But Maya's position here tonight wasn't just about the mission, it was about more than gathering evidence. It was about the constant reminder of her difference, the perpetual sense that no matter how well she blended in, the color of her skin set her apart. It wasn't the first time she'd felt this way, but the sharp awareness of it in a place like this made the tension all the more unbearable. Through her earpiece, hidden beneath the waves of her dark hair, she heard the faint crackle of her handler's voice. "Stay sharp, Maya. Ortega's settling in. Watch for any movement at the table. We've got eyes on him from outside, but we need you to stay close." Her lips barely moved as she whispered back, "Copy that." Her eyes shifted to Ortega's table. He was leaning back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the backrest as he spoke with his associates. He appeared relaxed, but Maya knew it was all a front. He was too seasoned, too careful to let his guard down completely. She needed to catch something incriminating. But even as she focused on the task at hand, the unsettling weight of being the only black person in the room pressed harder. She could feel their eyes, the judgment that hovered just beneath the surface, as if her presence disrupted the carefully curated balance of their world. She turned her head slightly and caught sight of a group of wealthy white patrons seated a few tables away. They were watching her, not overtly but with the kind of casual disdain that comes with unspoken assumptions. In their world she didn't belong, and the discomfort simmered under their polished exteriors. Maya shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. She wasn't here for them, but she couldn't deny the sting of their judgment. Even in her professional capacity, she was an outsider. The tension in the room shifted, becoming palpable as the front door of the restaurant opened and a uniformed figure strode in. Officer Ethan Reynolds. Tall, broad-shouldered, and imposing, his presence commanded attention not because of any real authority, but because of the way he carried himself, as if he was entitled to the space around him. Maya didn't need to look up to know what was coming. She could feel the shift in the room. The stares from the white patrons became sharper, their murmurs more pronounced, as if her mere presence had invited scrutiny. Reynolds scanned the room with a casual arrogance, his eyes glinting with the confidence of a man used to being in control. But when his gaze landed on Maya, it lingered. His body language stiffened, his brow furrowing slightly. Maya felt the weight of his stare, the assumptions already forming in his mind. It wasn't hard to guess what he was thinking. She didn't belong here. Not in a place like this, not surrounded by these people. The look in his eyes said it all. Maya kept her gaze low, pretending to be engrossed in the menu. She had hoped to remain under the radar, but it was too late. Reynolds was making his way toward her, his boots echoing ominously against the marble floor. The air around her felt heavier with every step he took, and the conversations in the restaurant seemed to quiet down, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Miss Reynolds said, his voice low but laced with the authority of someone who believed in his own superiority. Maya looked up, her face a mask of calm neutrality. "Yes, officer." Reynolds gave her a once-over, his expression hardening as if trying to place her, to find a reason for her presence in the upscale restaurant. His eyes flicked to her table, noticing the lack of food, the empty glass. To him, she didn't fit the image of someone who would be dining here alone. His assumptions hung in the air, thick and unspoken. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" he asked, his tone condescending. Maya's pulse quickened, but she kept her composure. "I'm just having dinner." Reynolds wasn't convinced. His gaze swept around the room, as if to say, "You don't belong here. I'm going to need to see some ID." Maya clenched her jaw. This was not part of the plan. Her cover as a regular patron was supposed to keep her under the radar, but now Reynolds' presence was throwing a wrench into the operation. She couldn't risk blowing her cover by refusing, but she also couldn't reveal her true identity. "I'm sorry, but why are you asking for my ID?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with irritation. "Is there a problem?" Reynolds' eyes narrowed. "You seem out of place. I've had a few complaints about you, and I'm just following up." Complaints. Maya knew what this was. She had faced it too many times before. The quiet hostility, the polite but firm exclusions. But now it was being enforced with a badge and authority. She had to think fast, but Reynolds wasn't giving her any room to breathe. He was already motioning for backup, his expression smug, enjoying the control he wielded. "You're going to need to come with me for further questioning." The room around her seemed to freeze as Maya felt the eyes of every patron locked on her, the quiet judgment morphing into something uglier. She couldn't blow her cover. Not now. Not with Ortega watching from the bar, his sharp eyes catching the unfolding scene. But Reynolds was pushing her into a corner, his racial biases on full display. Maya stood, trying to remain calm, but inside, the frustration and anger simmered. She was being treated like a criminal, not because she had done anything wrong, but because of the color of her skin in a room full of privilege. And now, her mission, months in the making, hung by a thread, teetering on the edge of failure because of one man's prejudiced assumptions. As Reynolds reached for her arm, the weight of the injustice settled on her chest like a heavy stone, but she knew one thing: this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Maya Johnson sat at the corner table of the upscale restaurant, the dim lighting casting soft shadows over the polished mahogany surfaces. She had chosen a quiet spot near the back, the perfect vantage point to observe Carlos Ortega's interactions without drawing attention to herself. But tonight, despite her well-practiced ability to blend in, she could feel the eyes of the room creeping toward her. The murmur of polite conversation had subtly shifted. The white patrons, dressed in tailored suits and designer gowns, were no longer focused on their expensive meals. Their whispers floated through the air like poison, carrying fragments of judgment and disdain. Maya could hear them without needing to focus. What's she doing here? I don't think she belongs. She looks out of place. Her fingers lightly traced the rim of her water glass, eyes scanning the room discreetly. Maya's training had taught her to stay calm under pressure, but the collective gaze of so many entitled strangers weighed heavily. She was the only black woman in the restaurant, and in their eyes, that was enough to raise suspicion. Maya had seen this play out countless times, this silent, unspoken segregation that hung in the air, like invisible chains tethering her to society's prejudices. Before she could refocus on the mission, a voice cut through the murmurs, deep and authoritative. "Excuse me, miss." Maya looked up to see Officer Ethan Reynolds, standing tall with his chest puffed out, his police uniform immaculately pressed. His face held the look of someone who had already made up his mind about her, long before he'd even approached. He wasn't here for Carlos Ortega, he was here for her. "Can I see your ID?" The room seemed to hold its breath. All conversations paused, the tension hanging so thick you could cut it with a knife. Maya locked eyes with Reynolds, feeling the racial profiling seep through his gaze. He wasn't just asking for her ID, he was questioning her right to exist in this space. Maya, though calm, felt the familiar weight of injustice settle in her chest. She could sense the patrons watching the scene unfold, their eyes narrowed, some curious, others hostile. Their thoughts were practically written on their faces. Who is she? Why is she here? Reynolds didn't break eye contact. His voice was louder now, drawing more attention. I said, "I'm going to need to see your ID." Maya's pulse quickened, but her outward demeanor remained steady. She reached slowly into her purse, her movements controlled. She knew the game. As a black woman, any sudden move could be perceived as a threat. As a federal agent, she'd been trained to de-escalate situations like this. But tonight wasn't about her skills or her training. It was about her race. "I'm just having dinner, officer." "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice cool and composed. Reynolds smirked, a sneer hidden beneath his professional facade. "You don't look like someone who belongs here, that's the problem." The murmurs in the restaurant grew louder. Maya could hear the whispers turning more vicious now. "She doesn't belong here. This is a place for people like us." The hostility was palpable, thickening the air with every judgmental glance. Maya handed her ID to Reynolds without a word, knowing that this simple act was not about law enforcement, it was about power. It was about control. And most importantly, it was about making an example of her. Reynolds looked at the ID, back at her, then at the ID again. The disgust in his eyes was clear. "Maya Johnson, huh? You don't exactly fit the profile of someone who dines alone in a place like this." The patronizing tone cut through Maya's resolve, but she kept her face neutral. Her FBI badge was tucked away, out of sight, and revealing it now could compromise months of undercover work. She couldn't afford to blow her cover. Not now, not when she was so close to the end of the operation. But Reynolds wasn't here for questions. He was here to humiliate her. Despite the growing tension, Maya remained calm, her professional demeanor never wavering. But she could feel the scene escalating. This wasn't just a casual ID check. Reynolds had something to prove, and he wasn't about to let her slip away without making her pay for what he saw as her audacity to exist in a space she didn't belong in. Reynolds glanced around, seeing the attention he was gathering. He thrived on it. "I'm going to need you to stand up," he ordered, his voice rising enough for the entire restaurant to hear. Maya didn't move immediately. "Is there a reason for this, officer? I haven't done anything wrong." But Reynolds was already motioning for backup, and the room buzzed with anticipation. What could she have possibly done wrong? The patrons leaned in, eyes wide, some of them shaking their heads as though her very presence justified whatever was coming next. Reynolds leaned in closer, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're coming with me for further questioning." A ripple of gasps spread through the room. Maya's calm composure faltered for a brief second, but she quickly regained her stance. She knew there was no talking her way out of this now. She had been profiled, humiliated, and now, in front of everyone, she was about to be arrested for no reason other than the fact that she was black, sitting in a place where people thought she didn't belong. "This is why they don't belong here," someone muttered from across the room. The sting of those words hit harder than Reynolds' smirk. Reynolds grabbed her arm, roughly pulling her from her chair. "Hands behind your back," he said, his tone filled with an authority that oozed superiority. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked into place around her wrists, each twist of the cuffs biting into her skin, as if to remind her of how little control she had in that moment. Maya was no stranger to high-pressure situations, but this was different. This wasn't a mission gone wrong. This was blatant racial discrimination playing out in real time, in front of an audience of onlookers who had already decided she was guilty of something. As Reynolds led her through the restaurant, patrons whispered and pointed, some wearing smug expressions as if they had been validated in their assumptions. I knew she was trouble. You can't just let anyone in here. The humiliation burned through her, but Maya held her head high. She wouldn't let them see her break, even as she felt the mission crumbling around her. Her cover was blown. Carlos Ortega had likely seen everything, and now suspicion would be cast over every move she had made in the investigation. Outside, the cool night air did nothing to ease the sting of the public humiliation she had just endured. The cuffs dug into her wrists as Reynolds pushed her toward the squad car, his smug satisfaction evident in every rough shove. The murmurs from inside the restaurant lingered in her mind as the car door slammed shut, and Maya sat in the back seat, staring out at the city lights. She had faced racism before, but tonight felt like a battle lost. Not just for her, but for every person who had ever been judged by the color of their skin rather than their character. As the car pulled away, Maya knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. The mission was compromised, but the fight for justice had only just begun. She wouldn't let this be the end. She couldn't. The system had wronged her, and it would continue to wrong others unless people like her, people who knew the pain of prejudice, stood up and fought back. Maya Johnson, despite the cuffs and the humiliation, wasn't broken. She was fueled, and this battle was far from over. The cold metal door clanged shut behind Maya Johnson as she stepped into the dimly lit holding cell. The harsh fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the sterile walls. She clenched her fists, feeling the tightness of the cuffs that had left red marks on her wrists, a physical reminder of the humiliation she had just endured. Every muscle in her body was tense, the residual sting of racial injustice gnawing at her insides. Maya had faced this before, being underestimated, dismissed, and disrespected because of the color of her skin. But this time was different. She wasn't just a black woman being profiled, she was an FBI agent on a high-stakes undercover mission, and the consequences of Officer Reynolds' racially motivated actions could unravel months of painstaking work. Outside her cell, Officer Ethan Reynolds swaggered around like a predator who had just captured his prey. His arrogance was palpable, his voice echoing through the otherwise quiet station. "Another one for the books, huh?" he said to Officer Jessica Cooper, his partner, who stood nearby, arms crossed and eyes downcast. She wasn't participating in his gloating, but her silence was deafening. She watched as Maya was shoved into the cell, her face flickering with discomfort, but she didn't say a word. Complicity spoke louder than any defense she could have offered. Maya sat on the metal bench, her eyes scanning the sterile environment as her mind raced. How could this happen? She had blended into some of the most dangerous environments in the world, successfully evading suspicion from hardened criminals. Yet here she was, reduced to just another black woman out of place in the eyes of someone like Reynolds. It was infuriating how the badge she wore was meaningless to him, how her identity was erased because he saw only her skin. The silence in the cell thickened, and Maya felt the weight of history pressing down on her. The air crackled with tension, not just from the present moment but from generations of racial oppression. Her thoughts drifted to her father, a civil rights lawyer who had warned her that no amount of success could shield her from the prejudice that still ran deep in America. She had always believed that her FBI badge, her success, and her dedication would set her apart. Yet here she was, just another statistic, just another black woman being profiled. Outside, Reynolds leaned against the desk, arms crossed, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "You can tell she doesn't belong in places like that," he muttered to Cooper, who only nodded uncomfortably, avoiding his eyes. "They think they can just walk into high-end restaurants like it's normal." Maya closed her eyes, breathing deeply to steady her rising anger. She wasn't going to let Reynolds win, wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her rage. But as the minutes ticked by, her thoughts kept circling back to the system that allowed officers like Reynolds to operate unchecked, to continue this cycle of bias and racial injustice. Even as an FBI agent, she wasn't immune to the institutional racism that had plagued her community for centuries, and she wasn't naive enough to believe that her colleagues wouldn't try to sweep this incident under the rug. She had seen it before, heard the stories from friends and family. This wasn't just about her, it was about a system designed to maintain control, to suppress voices like hers. Jessica Cooper's eyes flickered over to Maya's cell occasionally, her expression uneasy, as if she wanted to say something but didn't have the courage. Maya stared back, her gaze sharp, cutting through the silence between them. Cooper turned away, unwilling to confront the reality of her own complicity. Maya's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She didn't know whether to brace herself for more condescending remarks or an opportunity to explain herself, but one thing was certain: she would not be silent. The sound of the front door swinging open reverberated through the station, a sudden shift in the stale atmosphere. The tension was palpable as Agent Gabriel Harris strode in, his tall frame cutting through the room with an air of authority that instantly commanded attention. Dressed in a sharp, dark suit, Harris moved with purpose, his face hard and unreadable. He knew exactly what he was walking into, and his presence alone sent ripples through the station. Chief Samuel Phillips, standing by the front desk, straightened his posture as soon as he saw Harris enter. He wasn't expecting this level of escalation. A federal agent? Things had just gone from bad to worse. Phillips quickly tried to gather himself, but Harris wasn't giving him time to compose an excuse. Chief Phillips, Harris greeted curtly, his voice low but laced with the kind of authority that didn't need to be shouted to be heard. "I'm here to speak with Officer Reynolds about the arrest of one of my agents." The words landed heavily in the room. Phillips' eyes widened, and a nervous twitch crossed his face. He shot a glance at Reynolds, who was standing nearby, his smug demeanor quickly dissolving into confusion and panic. Agent Reynolds stammered, his voice cracking slightly. What agent?" Harris turned to face Reynolds, his eyes cold and piercing. "Maya Johnson is an undercover FBI agent, and your actions tonight not only jeopardized her mission but were also rooted in blatant racial bias." Reynolds froze, his face draining of color. The bravado he had worn so confidently just moments before crumbled under the weight of Harris' words. He had never anticipated this. To him, Maya had been just another black woman out of place, another easy arrest to assert his authority. Now, the reality of his actions was sinking in like a lead weight. Phillips stepped forward, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Agent Harris, I assure you this is a misunderstanding," he said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "We didn't know she was FBI. Officer Reynolds was just following protocol." "Protocol," Harris echoed, his voice calm but simmering with barely restrained anger. "Your officer racially profiled an innocent woman without probable cause, humiliated her, and arrested her in front of an entire restaurant. And you're calling this protocol?" Phillips stammered, his usual authoritative tone faltering in the face of Harris' unrelenting stare. I'm sure Officer Reynolds was just doing what he thought was necessary at the time." Harris cut him off sharply. Necessary? What was necessary about treating her like a criminal because of the color of her skin? Reynolds tried to find his voice, but the words stuck in his throat. I didn't know," he muttered, his voice weak. "I was just doing my job." "Your job is to protect and serve," Harris shot back, stepping closer. "Not to act on your own racial prejudices. You saw a black woman in a high-end restaurant and decided she didn't belong. That's not law enforcement, that's racism." The weight of Harris' accusation hung in the air, and for a moment, the entire station fell into an uncomfortable silence. Reynolds' eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but there was none to be found. Cooper stood frozen by the desk, her face pale, knowing she too had failed to act. Chief Phillips, realizing the gravity of the situation, tried once more to diffuse the tension. "Agent Harris, I assure you this will be thoroughly investigated. We'll handle this internally." "No," Harris interrupted, his voice steady but firm. "There will be no quiet investigation. Officer Reynolds will face the full consequences of his actions, and this precinct will be held accountable for what happened tonight. Racial profiling cannot be swept under the rug, not anymore." Reynolds opened his mouth to protest, but Harris silenced him with a sharp glance. The agent's presence was a wall of authority that Reynolds couldn't hope to scale. He had lost control of the situation the moment Harris had walked through the door. Harris turned to Phillips one last time. "Get Agent Johnson out of that cell. Now." Phillips nodded quickly, gesturing to an officer nearby. "Release her," he muttered, his voice tight with tension. The clang of the cell door echoed through the station as Maya stepped out, her expression calm but her eyes burning with resolve. She met Harris' gaze and gave him a small, grateful nod. He had done what needed to be done. He had forced the system to reckon with itself, at least for tonight. As they walked out of the station together, Harris leaned in slightly, his voice quiet. "You okay?" Maya nodded, though the exhaustion weighed on her. "I will be," she said, her voice steady but filled with the kind of determination that only comes from enduring deep injustice. "But this isn't over." Harris gave her a tight smile. "No, it's not." Outside, the cool night air washed over them as they made their way to the black SUV parked nearby. Behind them, the station buzzed with whispered conversations, officers exchanging nervous glances, knowing that this night would leave a lasting mark. For Maya, this was just another chapter in the long fight for justice. But she wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The mood in the police precinct was thick with tension. Officer Ethan Reynolds sat stiffly in the conference room, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. Across from him, Captain Samuel Phillips, who had led the internal review, stared at him with a stern, disappointed expression. The news of his suspension was a punch to the gut, but Reynolds was still clinging to his fragile sense of justification. "She looked suspicious," Reynolds insisted, his voice sharp but tinged with defensiveness. "That woman was out of place. A black woman alone in that kind of restaurant? It didn't add up." Special Agent Gabriel Harris, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, leaned forward, his voice calm but laced with authority. "Suspicious?" Because of her race, his eyes were hard as they bore into Reynolds, who shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Or was it because you couldn't see past your own prejudices?" Reynolds flinched, but he doubled down. "It wasn't like that. She didn't belong there. I was just doing my job." Harris stood, his height and presence looming over the room as he walked toward Reynolds. His tone was colder now. "Your job is to uphold the law impartially, to protect and serve without bias. You saw Maya, a black woman, and your instincts went straight to suspicion. Not because of anything she did, but because of who she is." Reynolds looked away, struggling to find words. The silence in the room was deafening. He felt the shame rising in him, but his mind clung to the idea that he was somehow justified. Yet deep down, something stirred a realization he hadn't wanted to face. His career was on the line, not because he had made a mistake, but because he had let his biases dictate his actions. Phillips cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Officer Reynolds, effective immediately, you are suspended pending further investigation. This is no longer just about an incident, this is about your failure to serve the community you're sworn to protect." Reynolds clenched his fists, the sting of those words settling heavily on his shoulders. He had always seen himself as a good cop, but now that image of himself was cracking, and the reality of what he had done was seeping in. He tried to respond, but the weight of it all left him speechless. The room seemed to close in around him as the consequences of his actions became real. As Reynolds left the room, the murmurs of his colleagues followed him. The gravity of what he had done was sinking in, but still, he struggled to understand why it had all gone so wrong. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about a system he was beginning to see had been broken all along. After her release, Maya Johnson stood outside the FBI field office, the city's night air cooling her tense skin. Despite the victory of getting out unscathed, the justice of what had happened gnawed at her. It wasn't about Reynolds alone. It was about a system that allowed officers like him to act on their racial biases without thinking twice. Maya's fingers rubbed the red marks left by the handcuffs, a bitter reminder of the reality she had just lived through. She had worn those cuffs not as a criminal, but as a black woman who had been judged long before she had even said a word. Her position as an FBI agent had saved her, but her mind kept circling back to those who weren't as fortunate. Her thoughts turned to the countless others who faced this kind of treatment, everyday black men and women who didn't have the privilege of flashing a badge to demand their release, who were profiled, arrested, or worse, based solely on the color of their skin. She had lived that reality for years, but tonight had brought it into sharper focus than ever before. The incident had left her angry but also resolute. She couldn't just let this slide as another isolated moment. This was about a system, one she had sworn to protect, that was still rife with prejudice and discrimination. The very institutions meant to uphold justice were often the ones perpetuating the worst kinds of injustice. Her chest tightened as she realized the weight of the battle she was fighting. This wasn't just about taking down Carlos Ortega, It was about pushing back against a larger, more deeply ingrained system of racism that stretched far beyond a single restaurant, a single officer, or a single case. As she walked into the field office, Maya knew that she was in for a long fight, one that went beyond the mission. This was personal now both for her and for the countless others she represented every time she walked into a room. Back at the restaurant, Carlos Ortega sat at the bar, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He had watched the entire scene unfold with Officer Reynolds and Maya, and it had left him unsettled. For a moment, it had seemed like just another instance of racial profiling, but something about the way Maya had carried herself, even in handcuffs, had raised his suspicions. Ortega wasn't a man who let things slip by unnoticed. He built his empire on details, on being aware of everyone and everything around him. And tonight something didn't add up. He signaled for his bodyguard, a thick-set man with a permanent scowl. "Find out everything you can about the woman they arrested tonight," Ortega murmured, his tone low but commanding. His mind raced with possibilities. Could she be more than just another patron in the wrong place at the wrong time? Could she be a threat? The money laundering operation he ran through this restaurant was sophisticated, but it was also fragile. He couldn't afford to let the wrong person slip through unnoticed. And now, with this incident, everything felt precarious. Ortega's gut told him to be cautious, and his gut was rarely wrong. As the night wore on, Ortega's paranoia grew. If Maya was more than she appeared, if she was connected to law enforcement anyway, it could unravel months of careful planning. He couldn't let that happen. The stakes were too high, and now he had to watch his every move. Maya had just become a dangerous variable, and Ortega wasn't the type to let things slide. As the days passed, Maya knew the stakes had been raised. Carlos Ortega was watching her closely now, his suspicion palpable. Every move she made, every place she went, she could feel his eyes on her, his network of people ready to report back anything that seemed out of the ordinary. The pressure was suffocating, but Maya was used to operating under fire. She sat in her car outside Ortega's latest business venture, her fingers tapping anxiously on the steering wheel. The mission was in jeopardy now, and every decision had to be calculated, precise. One wrong step, and not only would the investigation be blown, but Maya could find herself in real danger. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Gabriel Harris, his voice calm but urgent. "We're getting close, but Ortega's on to you, Maya. We need to move fast. He's starting to pull back on some of his operations." Maya nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I know, I can feel it. He's spooked, but we have to push forward. If we don't, he'll go underground, and we'll lose him." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Gabriel spoke again. "Just be careful, Maya. This isn't just about the case anymore. He knows you're a threat." Maya hung up, her determination hardening. She wasn't just in this to bring down Ortega anymore. This mission had become something more, a fight not only for justice but for her own survival. The racial divide that had haunted her from the moment she entered the restaurant that night had woven itself into the very fabric of the case. It wasn't just about catching a criminal. It was about standing up to the system that had cast her aside so easily. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. The climactic confrontation was inevitable. Ortega would make his move soon, and Maya had to be ready. Her resolve grew with each passing hour. She wasn't just fighting for her mission. She was fighting for every person who had been judged, dismissed, or profiled because of the color of their skin. The night was dark, and the air felt heavy with tension as Maya stepped out of the car, her heart pounding in her chest. The confrontation with Ortega was coming, and it would be the moment that defined everything: her career, her mission, and her fight against the very system that had betrayed her. But no matter what happened next, Maya Johnson was ready to fight back. She had faced worse, and she wasn't about to let the weight of systemic racism or the looming threat of Carlos Ortega stop her now.